All right, everybody, we're going to go and get started. There is a lot of ground to cover today. Obviously, there's a lot of news as it pertains to the DFARS 70 series with 7019, 7020, and 7021. But really today, this most applies to DFARS 7021 and some of the CMMC requirements. Obviously, there's some overlap here, but really, we spun this webinar up mainly just to have Richard join us and talk through the acceleration program, what's present day, what's by the end of the year, what's going to be next year. There's a lot of moving pieces on this particular program, and we're really excited that Microsoft has continued to put a lot of emphasis on helping their clients and their customers meet compliance in the Microsoft 365 platform as well as in Azure. And so I'm really excited to bring Scott also from our team, because obviously this impacts how we provide services to our clients as well. And kind of talking through how to use these tools as a business, or if you outsource any of your projects and efforts towards meeting CMMC and DFARS compliance, how to essentially use these tools to the best of your abilities to meet these requirements. So hopefully we'll kind of address most of those. Again, feel free to shoot in questions. We'll try to get to those rather in the live talk or afterwards. But nevertheless, I'm going to go in intro and get out of the way here. So first off, we have Scott Edwards from Summit 7. He is the president and brings 20 plus years of experience providing thought leadership around security and compliance and cloud services as a national speaker. This thought leadership has resulted in being invited to participate in CMMC working groups and speak at other conferences throughout the DoD community. Before Summit 7, Scott spent 6+ years working as a senior computer engineer and NASA data center chief engineer. Scott is a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and obtained a Master of Science in Computer Science from James Madison University. From Microsoft, we have Mr. Richard Wakeman. Richard Wakeman is the Senior Director of Aerospace and Defense for Azure Global at Microsoft. He specializes in the DIB, adopting cloud services from Microsoft. Richard engages with Microsoft partners and clients for end-to-end engineering and driving adoption for Azure Government and Microsoft 365, GCC High DoD, and Dynamics 365, GCC High, as solutions within the Microsoft US Sovereign Cloud. Richard joined Microsoft in 2007 and has worked with hundreds of the most prominent worldwide accounts. So again, Richard and Scott, thank you so much. And I'm going to hand it over to Scott and Richard.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Sean. I appreciate it. And so we're going to go ahead and get started here this morning. I'm really happy to have Richard with us. Richard brings obviously a great deal of background and information to us today. As we get ready to jump into this new world of the CMMC Acceleration Program and what that's going to do for you as customers in the Gov Cloud, getting ready for DFARS and CMMC requirements. So we're really excited to have Richard today. So what you can see now is the government platform is going to be the first thing we'll talk about a little bit. Richard's going to kind of give the overview that he gives many times about the government platform, how it's structured. I see we already actually have a question on the difference between the government platforms and the commercial platform and such. And so Richard's going to address some of those actually right away. So Omar, you're in good shape. We're going to get that question answered right off the bat. So, Richard, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you to jump into the next piece here. So okay. Let's jump in.
Yeah, thank you for having me and hosting me today. This is a wonderful opportunity to present the Microsoft CMMC Acceleration Program. In terms of looking at probably the most frequent question that we receive from our defense industrial-based customers is in alignment with which cloud they would choose, especially in protection of controlled unclassified information. In terms of looking at the multiple clouds, I typically like to go through a quick history lesson in terms of how we ended up evolving our cloud services to include multiple different data enclaves. You can see here that there is a build going on a little ahead of the dialogue. But if you look at, for example, the very first public multi-tenant offering that Microsoft made available is working with our education community and public sector community, deploying our very first productivity suite, which was back in the days of over 10 years ago with our business productivity online suite and what's now evolved into our Microsoft 365. And the enterprise offering is a global multi-tenant solution where we offer data residency in multiple different geographic locations around the world. This does meet a number of the requirements that we have for jurisdictions that would span, for example, different industries as well as government, and offer an ability to even do a multi-geo tenant to address multiple different compliance requirements that you would have globally. Now, if you look at the Microsoft 365 Enterprise, it is a worldwide solution. So you do have, for example, a follow the sun support model. You have a global network and, of course, routing and so forth. And I get into quite a bit of the details of disseminating, the differences between how we would manage data residency within our commercial cloud versus what we'll introduce as we get into our government clouds, where we would introduce true data sovereignty. Now, if you look at the introduction of our government community cloud, or what we oftentimes refer to as GCC, that came along about 8 years ago, in which case we had a gap in terms of being able to address the requirements for state and local government and primarily federal civilian agencies. So GCC is predominantly government entities that you would find within that environment, and it was ultimately a region of the commercial multi-tenant environment, in which case we could be able to achieve, for example, a FedRAMP accreditation. We just announced that we do have a FedRAMP High accreditation within GCC, and that's now paired with what came along in terms of an introduction of our Azure services with infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. Was introduced around the same time as GCC. So you'll find that there is a pairing between public multi-tenant GCC and Azure infrastructure as a service and platform as a service within the commercial multi-tenant environment. So Azure Commercial does have a FedRAMP High accreditation as well. As I mentioned, there's still a global network and, of course, follow the sun support model around Azure Commercial. And for certain components of GCC that are paired up with Azure Commercial, that really prevented us from being able to capture the especially the U.S. Department of Defense, as well as some of the federal cabinet level agencies that had a true requirement for example, data sovereignty that's aligned with the no foreign, and that's where we introduced the Azure government environment. There we go.
So Richard.
Yes.
Before we jump into the Azure Go side, I would like for you to dive in a little bit on what you said about follow the sun support. Can you explain a little bit about what that means with regard to the personnel who are involved in that support infrastructure and where that support actually comes from?
Yeah, so what, by way of example, if you have an issue with Azure Active Directory and you submit a support ticket, then you'll of course get a support engineer that's aligned with the Azure commercial environment, which would, in that case, could be a support engineer that would be outside the continental United States. Now, if you look at those support engineers, they by default do not have access to any customer data. So there is some controls that you can put into place, like customer lockbox. But because we do have the ability for foreign nationals to, for example, do support of those systems, like within Azure Active Directory, et cetera, it does prohibit Microsoft from being able to provide a contractual obligation to no foreign, which would align with us being able to say that we can give you a contractual amendment in GCC to protect, ITAR QE that is ultimately in alignment with export control data. That's where we introduced the sovereign cloud.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So looking at Azure Government, we built that about approximately 5 years ago, and primarily in support of the U.S. Department of Defense. It was initially built out as a DISA Security Requirements Guide Impact Level 5 environment. It also gave us a base foundation to begin delivering additional services within what I'll call the U.S. sovereign cloud. So if you just step one forward in the build, you'll notice that we built a cloud for the productivity suite, which is Office 365 Department of Defense, or DoD. And this cloud was built to an SRG Impact Level 5 control set, as well as FedRAMP High. And ultimately, the DoD environment is restricted to use by only those networks, federal information systems that are managed by the U.S. Department of Defense proper, which prohibits even some of the federal cabinet level agencies for being able to have access to that environment. So what we did is we built a twin copy of the U.S. DoD Office 365 Productivity Suite, and that's what you'll find is now branded Microsoft 365 GCC High. Now what you'll find is that GCC High environment is managed through an SRG Impact Level 5 control set. We'll oftentimes label it as IL4 equivalency by virtue of the fact that most of the customers that would be within that environment are more in alignment with an IL4 as opposed to an IL5. Of course, for the defense industrial base, there's not a specific requirement that you would have for the SRG. Those are for federal information systems, and that's where we align with, for example, the requirements for the DIB to include DFAR 7012 as well as NIST 800-171 coverage. And we'll go into that in a bit more depth as we go through our presentation today. But don't get tripped up by branding. What you'll find is that oftentimes we'll refer to branding of Azure for the infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, whereas software as a service is branded GCC High in this sovereign cloud. So there are services in Azure government, such as Azure Active Directory, that are truly sovereign to the United States, with only managed by screened U.S. persons. In which case, that Azure Active Directory instance in Azure government is branded GCC High. So oftentimes GCC High and Azure government are interchangeable in terms of branding. And looking at, that's why I differentiate oftentimes everything that you see on the right side of this chart would be our US sovereign cloud versus the left side would be more of our public multi-tenant environment.
Great, thanks. That's a really good overview, and I think that most of the people watching, many of them may have seen some of this before, but this is always a great topic to cover, especially as we start jumping in to talk about some of the next items that we have on the list here. So next we have the shared responsibility model. So obviously, as we are deploying out for these compliance requirements in the Microsoft Cloud, there's a shared responsibility model, between the organization that is deploying in the infrastructure and then Microsoft. And so, Richard, can you talk a little bit about how this shared responsibility model works with regards to NIST 800-171 and even NIST 853, for those organizations that need that kind of control set?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and oftentimes what we'll refer to as a shared responsibility model would be a set of controls that, of course, you can inherit natively from the Microsoft platform, assuming that you're in a cloud native configuration, and as well as those that are shared scope of responsibility or an organization only responsibility. Of course, the amount of that pie chart, if you will change depending on whether it's software as a service or naturally infrastructure as a service has a greater scale of number of controls that would be owned by the organization responsibility. I like to put it really into three different categories, right? There are, in context of the cybersecurity maturity model certification, there's 130 practices for CMMC level 3. And of those, there's only a few, like approximately 15%, that you can natively inherit from the Microsoft platform. Those are mostly physical controls. And in your system security plan, of course, you can be able to document that Microsoft would have coverage of those, especially those physical controls, in which case solutions are deployed on the cloud. as opposed to, of course, you'd still have to document your on-premises environment as well. But to look at the vast majority of those practices, approximately 60% are ones that are shared responsibility between Microsoft and the organization, right? The tenant owner. So by way of example, there's a lot of access control practices within CMMC, of which case we provide capabilities, right, in order for you to be able to demonstrate compliance for those specific practices. And we'll provide, of course, prescriptive guidance on how you would do that, and provide solutions, for example, for our partners to be able to extend to you. But it's still your responsibility to configure those in a compliant fashion and to go and demonstrate compliance to, for example, an assessor for a CMMC audit. And then, of course, what you see left over, there are many processes that are aligned with CMMC that simply would be 100% of the organization's responsibility. Now, if you flip forward one more slide. There you go. The amount of your shared scope of responsibility will be different depending on, as I mentioned, if you are deploying infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, as opposed to software as a service. Naturally, with Office 365, the PUT is considerably shorter, but then there's still a vast amount of customer responsibility to, for example, configure access control, as I mentioned, as well as device management, et cetera, to control access into the software as a service environment. So to net it out, what we have been focusing on with the CMMC Acceleration Program is to maximize the coverage for cybersecurity maturity model certification level 3 and above, right? Because level 1 is, of course, more process oriented. Once you get into level 3, that's where you have the alignment with NIST 800-171, in which case we would be able to, for example, map out how the capabilities of our service will help you to meet your compliance requirements using Microsoft technology for those shared scope of responsibility. And we've got, of course, quite a bit more investments in IaaS here initially, because there is a larger scope for infrastructure as a service.
Great. Thanks, Richard. So as we are about to flip into talking about the acceleration program in specific, can you address a little bit about as we go through this, the percentages with 800-171 and the CMMC level 3 requirements for 130 different practices that are there. Obviously a significant portion of those are on Microsoft from a responsibility standpoint. With the infrastructure, and there's a larger position that's really going to be about configuration. And now with the acceleration program, we're going to have a portion of those that may be configured through the acceleration program to help people get further down that road toward a compliant configuration. Right, that's kind of the whole goal. So if you could just address in general numbers of controls, if you have that kind of information, that would be great.
Yeah. One of the deliverables that we have that I'll present here in a moment is our product placemat, and what this illustrates is the ability for you to map all the Microsoft capabilities and products to become compliant, running in the Microsoft cloud, and in some cases even for hybrid deployments that would extend to on-premises and to other cloud service providers, using our suite of, for example, security and compliance tools. Now, for those, if you maximize those numbers, what we found is there's approximately 70% coverage, most of which is shared responsibility model between Microsoft and the tenant owner or the customer. So, the vast majority, as I mentioned, but you still get, if you, for example, if you went all in with Microsoft technology and you used a Microsoft 365 E5 and you leverage the capabilities that we have within Azure and Office 365 for compliance that you would be able to get approximately 70% of the way there with guidance, right? But we know that closing the gap, to get through that configuration to the 70% plus closing the gap to 100% is going to be customer responsibility, in which case we would rely heavily on our partner community and have been working and ultimately building the CMMC Acceleration Program in intention to be scaffolding for our partners and our customers. But many of our specially managed service providers that we know are required to be able to scale to the sheer numbers of the defense industrial base, especially going into the small medium size market with the tier 3 in the supply chain. That there's just such vast quantities that we're looking to have and enable our partner community like Summit 7 to be able to address and help with a lot of that configuration to the 70% plus the processes beyond that to close the gap.
Yeah, that's really great. And so there are so many companies that have to move into these compliant infrastructures, and everything that we can do working together, as we've been working with you on the acceleration program for the last few months, anything that we can do that's going to speed that process for the DIB is going to be obviously well received. And so I'm really excited about what we have here, and I'm really excited about getting this out for customers. So.
Yeah, likewise, it's been wonderful working with Summit 7 and helping to really steer where Microsoft helping us to even put some of these CMMC Acceleration Program artifacts together. If you look at the blogs that we have published, those are available. Links on the slide here, as well as if you go to my LinkedIn page or to our Microsoft Tech community for public sector, it's where most of these blogs have been published. One of the very first, call it table stakes, that we have with the Microsoft CMMC Acceleration Program is to work with our partners in the CMMC accreditation body and various other stakeholders for CMMC for us to define and have an agreement on what the program of reciprocity will be from the cloud service provider. As you know, if you look at NIST 800-171A, and as written, many of the controls with NIST, as well as even with the CMMC practices, do not have many accommodations for a CSP or for cloud use. So we've been going through this process of looking at, well, what's the best way for us to establish reciprocity so that you can inherit from us, so that you can be able to have compliant solutions that leverage the underlying platform, and so that you can be able to accelerate, for example, an assessment with a CMMC C3PAO audit, because there's certain aspects of the underlying cloud platform that you as a customer shouldn't have to go and one at a time have to assess the cloud service provider. So we would establish that reciprocity for you to be able to inherit that. Naturally, DFAR 7012 has a strict requirement for a FedRAMP moderate accreditation, which we hold a FedRAMP high provisional authorization within Azure, all of Azure, commercial and government, as well as now FedRAMP high within our government clouds, including GCC and GCC high. So we meet that benchmark that's required for reciprocity for NIST 800-171 and DFAR 7012 requirements of cloud service provider. Now, if you look in the data protection that's required for controlled and classified information, that's where you get into an alignment oftentimes with the Department of Defense Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guide. And if you look at our government clouds, we do have SRG alignment, and we can demonstrate compliance, for example, with SRG Impact Level 5 in our U.S. sovereign cloud, including looking at the equivalency for IL4 and GCC high. So that does have call it the higher watermark for compliance that you can be able to demonstrate for protection of controlled and classified information, especially paired together with, in the U.S. sovereign cloud, of us having a contractual obligation for ITAR, right? So those are, of course, all things that we can demonstrate and our customers can leverage, right?
Yeah, that's really great.
Now, if we step forward into the CMMC Acceleration Program intention, as I mentioned before, we have been targeting CMMC Level 3 initially. We will, of course, go to full Level 5 as more details emerge, especially from the accreditation body and from DISA that are still working on assessment guides, etc. The intention initially is to have, of course, as I mentioned, scaffolding for our partners to build managed solutions on. So that would give capabilities, establishing the reciprocity, etc. For the intention that Microsoft, working with our partners, can be able to deliver pre-configured environments. And if you look at that pre-configured environment, that may be a fully hosted environment where you would lift and shift an entire organization into the cloud, call it a cloud native solution for an entire company, versus there's also opportunities to build out shared data enclaves. Oftentimes I call them mission enclaves. This may be an environment that's hosted, for example, by one of the DIB Tier 1 prime contractors, where they would have a control environment that would control data egress so that they can invite in their supply chain right within that environment and be able to meet the higher bar for compliance, not necessarily eliminating those subcontractors from having to go get CMMC themselves. They will need to, but it does enable, for example, especially once you start introducing the higher levels, 4 or 5, where these DIB prime contractors simply would have a higher level of requirements for these mission clouds. So they're ultimately segmented environments that you could host.
I mean, we see that with our customers today. We're seeing more and more traction, more customers asking for an enclave type approach, especially the larger businesses. Smaller businesses are typically going kind of all in, like you were saying earlier, right? But the larger businesses, many of them are starting to build out enclave approaches, especially leveraging things like Windows Virtual Desktop in Azure to have kind of that full desktop environment sitting in Azure, leveraging Office 365 and the rest of the Azure services, and basically separating it out from some of their on-prem infrastructure and such. So it's definitely an approach that I see happening more often with our customers, and I think we're going to continue to see that method of configuration.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we could go on for probably hours on the topic of whether or not you go all in, or if you decide to swivel seat, as I call, where you have 2 different panes of glass, and of course control data transfer between environments that would protect controlled and classified information, especially important for covered defense information, technical documentation that would be export controlled.
One of the things that you brought up a second ago, is you see here that, we're currently targeting CMMC Level 3 with the acceleration program as it sits today, right? But you brought up CMMC Level 4 and Level 5, and especially from an enclave standpoint, supporting, down level subcontractors to be able to get access to a Level 4, Level 5 environment. That's certainly an area that I think that, you're going to see primes moving into. And we've done some analysis of the platform, obviously some of that with you. And we see no blockers right now within the Microsoft Cloud to be able to get to Level 4, Level 5 within the Microsoft Cloud. Have you run across anything that you think that may be a hurdle at this point for Level 4, Level 5 within the Microsoft Gov Cloud?
No, not at all. I mean, we already achieve a higher level of obligations and standards and compliance that would even exceed a Level 5. There's some unique aspects to especially Level 5 that we believe will be a significant concern for our customers, which is why there's this run to partner up and make sure that there's a whole community to support our customers out there. For example, once you get into a Level 5, you have a very strict requirement for real-time monitoring and having a security operations center, a SOC, and many of the smaller companies, even medium-sized companies, to stand up a SOC is less than trivial, right?
Absolutely. I mean, with Level 4 and Level 5, really the biggest piece is around people and process. It's really not even the technology at those levels. It's really, do you have the right people doing the right processes threat hunting, investigation, those kinds of capabilities that really sets level 4 and level 5 apart.
Yeah, for certain. And leveraging capabilities of our platform, such as Microsoft Azure Sentinel, that's our SIEM and SOAR solution, play a very significant role in those SOCs and in those real-time monitoring and threat hunting, et cetera. So we've been making investments, for example, into building out workbooks that align with CMMC that are available within the Sentinel, and that works across both Azure and Office. So looking at some of the announcements that we've made here in our recent blog is around the Microsoft Compliance Manager. We're really excited about this. It went general availability for the first time just this last month in October, aligned with Ignite. And inside of, you can think of the Microsoft Compliance Manager as being a GRC tool that we have built into our Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. So it has coverage over the Microsoft 365 product suite. That's of course the productivity suite with Office 365, as well as many of our security products such as Intune and MCAS, Cloud App Security that we have as part of our security suite and Azure Information Protection. And we have the ability to, for example, overlay a set of assessment templates into the Compliance Manager. So those assessment templates are a set of templates that would define the rules in alignment with each of the controls or practices in the case of CMMC that you would need to configure in order to raise your compliance score. So there's both a set of actions that you would take. By way of example, one of the actions for CMMC in NIST 800-171 is you must implement multi-factor authentication and enforce it across the entire tenant. So there is a set of guidance where it points you to, for example, Azure Active Directory to configure a conditional access policy that will enforce MFA. And if you do so and you complete that successfully, then it's going to raise your compliance score. Now, I will just caution you that the compliance score today is something that's fairly arbitrary based on the developers of the assessment templates. We have had some interest in some open discussions now to looking at how that compliance score could be weighted better in alignment with the NIST 800-171A assessment guide, so that those could align. As we speak, we have the assessment templates for NIST 800-171 as well as CMMC levels 1 through 5, and we of course would embrace any feedback that you would have as you begin to use these. Now it is limited to commercial, but the good news is that the team that manages the Compliance Manager has committed to deploying this within the government clouds by the end of this year. It may even surprise us with early release here this month in November. So that would become available within Microsoft 365 GCC High by the end of this calendar year.
So Richard, a couple questions on that.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that the scoring, you're looking at doing some weighting with that. Are you going to make that weighting, match kind of the DIBCAC process around, the scoring that we have for the medium and the high assessments that DCMA would be doing, or are you looking at just straight 800-171? How are you looking at potentially making that work out?
It's early in the discussion. I would say we're very malleable on that front and open to feedback. The one thing that I will call out is that these assessment templates do not have full coverage of any one practice in many cases where there's still a shared scope of responsibility by the customer. So any score that you would see coming out of the Compliance Manager would be mostly partial in contribution to most of the practices, right? It shows and demonstrates where you are doing the right configurations within your tenant to meet those compliance requirements per control, but keeping in mind that there still is shared scope of responsibility even beyond that you would have to be accountable for.
Can you just dive in a little bit on that? Because one of the things on the previous slide, if we could go back real quick, there's a difference between configuration and configuration versus reporting, and how does compliance manager fit within that scope? Does compliance manager allow you to actually do one-click configuration, or is it more of a reporting tool, basically showing you what you have configured in your environment?
Yeah, it's more of a reporting tool at this point. It is tied into a real-time configuration of your tenant. By way of example, if you've enforced MFA, then it would show you a real-time, reporting, but also, have an ability for you to one-click go and enable multi-factor authentication. That may be acceptable for that default rule by many organizations, especially small and medium size, but we all know that there's, especially within the defense industrial base, exceptions to that MFA rule, such as if you're using Windows Hello for Business on Windows, or if you're using another third-party provider such as Duo for multi-factor on Mac and Linux, or wherever else, that naturally the compliance manager is not going to report back on what your configuration is on Duo. So
absolutely,
yeah. But it's very valuable. I mean, we've gotten really good feedback and would love to continue to evolve that. Now, the Azure Security Center is similar to the Compliance Manager, but the Azure Security Center is part of Infrastructure as a Service and Platform as a Service. We've now rebranded this into Azure Defender. Within Defender, we have the ability to be able to present what are called Azure Blueprints. Blueprints are a set of policy initiatives as well as automations through such as Resource Manager, scripts and templates that you can be able to apply to an Azure subscription. And similar to the Compliance Manager, it results in a view, reporting back to you on how you would achieve, very specific controls and how they're configured on, for example, virtual machines or virtual network within Azure. So they're synonymous. The Azure Blueprints are similar to Azure as the assessment templates and Compliance Manager applied to the software as a service world with Microsoft 365. We do have currently a Azure Blueprint sample for NIST 800-171 that you can apply to subscriptions in both Azure Commercial and Azure Government. Today, we have, as part of this acceleration program, are building a CMMC Level 3 Azure Blueprint that we'll actually preview next week. So we're beginning the previews for that. We will go into a public preview next month in December. We have no line of sight on general availability, though, for any CMMC Level 3 deliverables that we have until I believe we will probably get through the whole provisional period with the assessments that are being done, especially for Level 3, because there's still a lot of unknowns out there. But we'll continue to evolve these blueprints and assessment templates as we learn more about how CMMC Level 3 will be ultimately assessed.
That's great. So from an infrastructure standpoint, which is what the Azure piece really does. So, laying down these blueprints is going to allow us to quickly configure an environment, at least a minimal environment, to some percentage of configuration, say 50, 60% of configuration for CMMC. Is that kind of what the target is?
That is the target. Yeah, it is.
Right.
And, of course, a holistic solution would require components that are over in the Microsoft 365 side. So if you deploy an Azure Blueprint, for example, that would apply to an Azure subscription for virtual networking and virtual machines or Azure SQL, et cetera, you would still need to have coverage, for example, of the Microsoft 365 suite. That would include device management through Intune, making sure that any of the devices that are connecting into your network are trusted devices and currently in policy, for example.
Yeah, I tell you, as we have done, hundreds now of these implementations, and to the CMMC or NIST 171 standard, and the migrations into the platforms, that is really the sticky point, that we run across every time. It's migration and device management. Those are the two big ones. Those are the two difficult places that it takes so much time and so much effort to get correct, because you start touching users and you start touching user data, and when you start touching your users and you start touching your user data, that's where a lot of the time comes in. So it's certainly something that has to get a lot of attention.
It sure does. In fact, I would say one of the big differences in the defense industry, especially the DIB, as compared to many of the customers that I've worked with. I've been doing migrations to Office 365 for over 13 years, or the previous technologies before that. Oftentimes you would evolve into a state where you would say, hey, our goal is to get to a point to where we would only allow access by trusted devices and people that are connecting from trusted networks, or some combination of conditional access controls. Whereas the DIB have a very strict requirement that you have to come right out of the starting gate with enforcing these rules, especially in protection of controlled unclassified information. So there isn't an option to say we're going to get there. We have in our POAM that we're going to start managing all of our devices. No, all your devices have to be managed now.
Right, absolutely.
Be compliant, which is where zero trust comes into play. If you look at zero trust, the whole principle here is to never trust and always verify. So if you want to go and get access, for example, to some data repository or application hosted in Azure, for example, that may contain controlled and classified information, then nobody may have access to that data as a standing concern. It may be that the only way that they can get access to it is through some sort of privileged workstation, or through a trusted device, as I mentioned, maybe even trusted networks, etc. So the zero trust model is really something the Department of Defense has been embracing. We are also making significant investments across Microsoft and, of course, within Azure Global to deliver a zero trust architecture. And we have already built a number of automations that are available for applying an Azure blueprint to an Azure subscription that is available as a repo on GitHub. I've linked to it here as well as into my blog. I'll just say that we have a major refresh of that coming next month. So the zero trust architecture is being developed in coordination with our Microsoft design for zero trust, much of which is in alignment with the NIST definition as well. Now, because there's been such a moving target with CMMC, especially level 3, I haven't yet mapped the zero trust architecture blueprint to CMMC level 3. So our intent is to go ahead and release this zero trust architecture next month, and then we'll do an exercise in the first half of 2021 to then go and fine tune it and provide documentation that will be specific for CMMC. Product placemat, super excited about this. We have it coming out in preview next week as well. So the product placemat is, think of it as our consolidated set of guidance around the cybersecurity maturity model certification. The level 3 placemat that I have a screenshot of here is an interactive user interface. So it's not static. In fact, I've had some people say, hey, can you give me a better screenshot of this? And I'm like, well, actually, the placemat is not just a screenshot. It is literally the ability for you to be able to identify how Microsoft products would be able to contribute to compliance across all the different families of CMMC practices. And there's also a mapping that's inherently built in here for NIST 800-171 as well. So that schema for CMMC, of course, is what's represented in the periodic chart, but you'd have a crosswalk into NIST 800-171 as well. And illustrated here, you can see that this is the maximum set of Microsoft products, in which case, we are able to achieve, over 70% of CMMC practice coverage. Now that is a shared scope of responsibility in almost all these controls. If you were to reverse out, so this is the maximum using, for example, Microsoft 365 E5 SKU. If you were to look at a view of it with no products applied, then it would be closer to like 17% as opposed to over 70%.
Yeah, this is a great product, and kudos for the work that's been done on this. Like you said, 70% coverage within the product stack. If everything is configured appropriately, obviously there's shared responsibility there, right? So, while Microsoft does a lot of the infrastructure pieces, the customer still has to, do a lot of configuration here. And, that 70% maps to, I'm thinking back to kind of the bigger map. There's still over, I think it's 12 to 1,300 different configuration items. When you look across all those products. So, there's a significant amount of stuff behind that product placemat that really has to get done from a shared responsibility model standpoint. So, but this is a great product, and this is going to be great for our customers to be able to get a better view of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it has customer implementation guidance also built into it. We'll distill that out into a mini SSP that our customers can leverage as well. So if you look at the cybersecurity reference architecture quickly, this is just a single visualization of all of our, especially our security suite, and how that applies for identity access, information protection, client management, etc. We do have a new version of this that will be aligned with all the rebranding that we did, especially around the Defender, that will be coming out here in a couple of weeks as well. So great tool. I think of this reference architecture as being like a level 100 view versus the product placemat would be a level 200 view with more depth. And then, of course, getting into the reference architectures that are paired with documentation such as system security plans, et cetera, would be the level 300 and above, right? It would be getting down to the nuts and bolts. Again, even with the reference architectures they're still paired together with customer scope of responsibility for those. So I see many questions too, so I'm not sure how much time we have left here.
So I've got a few more slides I'm going to go through here, and then we're going to jump into some questions. There has been a very active set of questions come through. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but we will try to get to some of them. And we will follow up with those that we're not able to get to. We'll follow up with those offline so that we get answers to everybody who did ask questions where possible. So where does this leave us? I mean, Richard, you've added fuel to the fire here, right? You've gotten a lot of people excited about, what this capability is going to be, how it's going to help the DIB really get secure in the Microsoft cloud, which is all of our goals, right? We want to make sure that the DIB can do that as quickly and as easily as possible. And so where do we go from here? So what is the bottom line? Microsoft is investing. It's investing in the support of this infrastructure in the government infrastructure to protect the government data. They have gone above and beyond, in my opinion, on what they've done with things like the Acceleration Program and the work that you've done, Richard, and your team has done. So I think that's great. There are tools in this package that are being released. All of these are tools that can be used. There are no silver bullets here, but it is a set of tools that can be used to help speed your way in to the platform, help you secure the environment, and do it in a way that maybe it cuts your time to deploy down a little bit. There's going to be more, just like Richard said, coming out in 2021. Obviously, the placemat's coming out. There's new Azure blueprints coming out. And these products are going to continue to get revved as we go through the year. And then, toward the end of this year, we're going to have all of this, the compliance manager being pushed into GCC High, which everybody's going to be very excited to see, I'm sure. It is an ongoing and maturing effort. Richard, what would you say when we get to this time next year? What would you say that this product is going to look like at that point?
Yeah, the way I think of the acceleration program is, instead of it being a product in and of itself, it's really a collection, as you see, of many different tools. In fact, it's been a cross-team effort. Naturally, I'm within Azure Global, and most of the work that I would deliver with our teams are very specifically aligned with Azure infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, right? So we're working and joining together with, for example, the Office product group and the security product group and Microsoft Consulting Services and various other organizations across Microsoft to really pull together this collection of resources. So you'll find that as we continue to evolve this program into next year, that especially as we get more clarity on how CMMC Level 3 will be assessed, what you'll see is we'll continue to refine the reference architectures and especially the documentation that gets paired with it. So by this time next year, we should be able to say that we have, for example, a mini SSP that would be the configuration of your environment on the Microsoft platform, and that would be, ultimately close the gap or be the what we like to try and call the easy button to help accelerate to getting through an assessment for CMMC Level 3 or of course, NIST 800-171A assessment as well for registration and SBRS.
Yeah, so that is going to be a great help when you start talking about taking, the configuration, with this SSP output, if you will, and it's really an input is what it is. It's an input into your actual SSP. It's not going to be a case where you're going to be able to take that deliverable and turn that over to an assessor and say, here's our SSP, right? It's an input into your overall organizational SSP for the system as it's scoped. And so that's kind of brings us to the next slide I hear is, what do you have to do beyond the program to continue to move toward either NIST 800-171 DFARS compliance or CMMC Level 3 compliance? The first thing is you still have to have that full SSP. You've got to make sure that you are documenting everything, that you have all the information about both your cloud environments, your on-prem environments, your endpoints. All of that has to be documented in the SSP with the appropriate scope around it. When you're looking at migrating into these platforms, there's still migration to deal with and endpoints to deal with. So there's a lot that you have to do, a work that you have to do around that kind of project. There's additional configuration going to be required for Azure. Even if you lay down these blueprints, like Richard said, you're going to have to, close the gap between that 50 to 60% configuration and the actual fully compliant configuration that's going to meet all of your specific needs for features and infrastructure as you're deploying these things out. The configuration for Office 365, as Richard said earlier, the compliance manager today is really a reporting tool. There's going to be a movement long term to add in some configuration capability, linking to configuration items and those kinds of things. But you're still going to have to execute the configuration of the Office 365 environment. Is that accurate, Richard?
It is, and there's, I would say, an opportunity for Microsoft and our partners to come together on, for example, templates for data protection policies that are reusable across multiple organizations. So you'll find that there are components of Office 365 where we can be able to have community or industry-led solutions, especially for Office 365 and protection of controlled unclassified information that's over email with data loss prevention capabilities and so forth, labeling capabilities. But yeah, the configuration for Office 365 is manual at this point in time, and we'll take a community effort to really get to, I'd say, a consensus on how you would, for example, label CUI effectively outside of Office 365.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, for the next point I have here is really about, the full scope reporting against Level 3. There's a lot that has to be done. Process, procedure, the maturity level processes, all of those still have to be done. This is not going to provide that for you. So, none of that, the documentation outside of what eventually may happen with, kind of the SSP output as an input to your SSP, outside of that, all of the other stuff is still going to have to be done. This acceleration program is not going to help you there. As there's no way it could. And then, the ongoing management and reporting pieces, everybody, our customers, right now, everybody is really focused on getting these platforms configured appropriately, getting, into the platform, using the platform right off the bat. But the ongoing management and reporting of these infrastructures, that's going to be the next hurdle that people have to grapple with is, okay, I've gotten into the platform. It's functional. It's secured. I've built it correctly. I've built my SSP. I got my procedures and policies. Now I have to do that day-to-day ongoing management of the environment. And how are you going to do that? Do you do that in-house? Do you leverage an MSSP? Do you leverage an MSP to help you with that? That is going to have to still be tackled, right? So what are we doing at Summit 7? How are we going to leverage this specific product or this capability, this tool set? We are going to fully integrate the acceleration program into all of our projects. So as we are revving our projects, and we do go through constant revs of our projects for configuration as new products are deployed into the Microsoft platform, as things change with configuration requirements and compliance requirements, we rev those products. And as part of that, we're going to integrate this whole capability into that. And what that might do is it is going to allow us to get to a configured environment potentially quicker, which hopefully results in some cost savings for our customers long term. But I think the biggest impact is going to be on deliverables because we're now going to be able to provide more detailed, more rich deliverables based on the data that we're going to be able to pull out of the platforms using Compliance Manager, using potentially this SSP, export capability for the configuration. We do provide some of that today, all of that today, but it's not as automated. And so it's a more manual process, which obviously, that should eventually end up, bringing costs down of these projects and the timeline to deploy, which is great. And then, beyond the configuration and implementation component, this is going to help us dramatically on the managed services side for updates and reporting capabilities. So we're going to be able to get a lot more information out of the tenants using these tool sets than we're able to get today. From a security standpoint, from a monitoring standpoint, using Defender and using Azure Security Center, very excited about what we're able to do with the acceleration program and what's coming out of the acceleration program for the ongoing support pieces. So what are our next steps? We're about out of time here. I think we got just a couple minutes left. If you have questions, please feel free to send email to CMMC. To the CMMC email address there. We have to continue the efforts that we have in place. Obviously, the SPRS November 30th deadline is out there. Everybody's trying to get everything ready for that November 30th deadline. So continue on that path. Do what you're doing to close whatever gaps you have left and get those reports done correctly for SPRS. Be on the lookout for the continued updates for the CMMC Acceleration Program. They're going to continue to roll out over the next, the next year. Additional capabilities coming out. Integrate those into your processes and procedures. Integrate those into your infrastructure, and leverage the capability. It's great capability that Microsoft's providing, and you should really take advantage of it. Don't forget about your on-premises and other cloud services configurations. Obviously, if you're doing on-prem, you're fully responsible for that. You've got to do all of this, kind of work there, documenting it and such. If you're in other cloud services, then, you're going to have to get these same kinds of capabilities in those other cloud services. And so you got to make sure that you're focused on that too. And then, one of the last points I want to make is don't forget the policy and procedure piece of this. Okay. There are, lots of people out there that can help you if you need help with documenting your policies and procedures, getting those maturity level processes identified, writing those up, making sure that you're following them. And it's more than just writing them up and having them on a shelf. It's integrating them into your infrastructure, integrating them into your way of doing business, into the culture of your organization. This is a sea change in how most organizations are managing data. And so we have to drive all of these new processes and procedures into the fabric of the organization. Otherwise, we're going to end up in a situation where we're not actually doing the things that we need to do to maintain the environments once they get in place. Okay. With that, I think that's my last slide for today. We're going to jump in and do a couple questions. Like I said, we did get a lot of questions throughout the presentation, but I want to get as many of these as we can. And Sean, you have some questions teed up for us?
Yes. Let's see here.
Let me make a comment really quick.
Yeah, go for it, Richard.
We've been noticing that we've had kickbacks for people emailing the CMMC at Microsoft.com. I'm trying to service that on the back end to find out why that distribution group is currently broken. If you are unable to get through on CMMC at Microsoft.com, I hope to have that resolved today. But you can always reach out to me too. My email address is my first name dot last name at Microsoft.com. So Richard.Wakeman at Microsoft.com, and you can use that in lieu of the CMMC alias.
Yeah, you heard it here, folks. Send as many emails as you can to Richard.Wakeman at Microsoft.com. All right. So getting into some of these questions, I thought this was interesting, Richard. This one's going to be for you. Do you think Microsoft will offer a certification course of any kind as a part of this acceleration program?
So there is a lot of discussion around readiness, both for our partner community as well as even potentially and looking at how even C3PO, the assessors, would be cloud ready for being able to understand how to score and understand reciprocity and everything on the cloud service provider. And that's not just specifically unique to Microsoft. There's that challenge, I believe, for any assessor understanding how to go in and assess a customer that's running in the cloud. So the short answer is yes, we have training that's coming out that we will target for customers and partners here by the end of this year. And then we're also in discussions with, for example, the CMMC accreditation body and what it would look like to build training or to have supplementary training even for assessors and registered provider organizations.
Okay, awesome. Next question is what, so many folks have asked, okay, November 30th, that's looming. I need to get through some of the DFARS requirements and some of the reporting requirements for DFARS 7019 and 7020. Mm-hmm. What are some things that companies can begin using now for GCC High?
Yeah, so, if you look at GCC High being specifically the productivity suite, we have been working on and have, of course, materials that are around how we demonstrate compliance for NIST 800-171. There's the compliance manager with the assessment templates that will come to GCC High here in the next month or so. So those will become available. In terms of looking at the full picture, there are a number of those reference architectures that I mentioned that we're currently in development of that will extend out into 2021. So we'll have more announcements as those evolve as part of the CMMC Acceleration Program.
Okay, awesome. Let's see here. From a licensing standpoint, compliance manager currently limited to E5 subscriptions. Is there a chance that some of the compliance manager features will eventually be a part of E3, et cetera, or an add-on situation?
Yeah, and I've been getting that question quite a bit. I'm an engineer and don't necessarily, deal with licensing as much. I will say this. It's not a license required per user in order to use the compliance manager, right? There needs to be a license for E5 to be able to enable that capability. So the way that I would typically rationalize it is that for you to have access to the compliance manager with the assessment templates, that your administrators that would be using it would, of course, be licensed for E5.
Okay. I think one of the last questions that we've gotten several different versions of, it has a lot to do with your blog, Richard. And that is as far as from platforms and how to choose which. First question, we'll keep it CMMC and then we'll go DFARS and really CUI requirements. Can you meet level 3 compliance? And as you guys have continued to work towards the program and all the various parts of the program, can you meet CMMC level 3 requirements via the Microsoft 365 commercial platform or within that version of the platform?
So, in terms of looking at CMMC, it is a set of practice, especially in alignment with NIST 800-171, that you can demonstrate compliance with CMMC in any of the clouds, right? I mean, that's why you even have like a requirement for DFAR 7012 that says FedRAMP moderate or equivalent, right? So what's the definition of that, and how would that be enforced by assessors? I wrote a full article rationalizing some of this. It's based on an argument for protecting controlled and classified information. There's no definition that's outlined in CMMC that would differentiate between, for example, QE basic versus QE specified, such as those that would be export control data, right? And at the end of the day, if you're looking at protecting controlled and classified information to the higher watermark, then naturally that would have to include export control data. So that would be in ITAR. If you were to look at becoming compliant with ITAR within the commercial side environment, it is fully your scope of responsibility. You will not get a contractual obligation from Microsoft to protect ITAR data. We will only provide that in our US sovereign cloud, which is Microsoft 365, GCC High, and Azure Government, where we know that all of our backend systems are continental United States, CONUS. The networks are restricted to CONUS. We've got only screened US persons, in fact, citizens that manage that environment. So that's how we're able to get to the IL5 plus no foreign requirements and have a contractual obligation for it. So and there's a lot of discussion have been around how to potentially protect ITAR data in the commercial side environment. If you use, for example, encryption, maybe third-party encryption, and that would be applied on, for example, documentation before it's stored in the cloud, so it's opaque to the cloud service provider. There may be a path for you to demonstrate compliance for ITAR and commercial, but it's fully your scope of responsibility, right? It's not something that Microsoft is going to give you a cookbook on how to become ITAR compliant in commercial, right?
Right. All right. Well, I think that more or less covers it. And thank you so much for your time today. And we look forward to seeing you next time.